Today I'm back with Matt Kay, and we thought that we're going to sit down to talk a little bit about core wounds, sort of how they develop, why we even want to talk about it, especially in the context of the awakening journey, awakening process. And so, hi, Matt.
Hello.
I want to apologize because it's so hot here in our country that I feel like it's literally affecting my brain and my ability to sort of articulate and make sense. So please forgive me if I feel like I'm a bit all over the place and then focus. So Matt, what's the first thing that comes to you when you think about core wounds in the context of awakening?
Um, so, like awakening is one thing, we kind of like wake up out of, that's the initial kind of realization that there's something which isn't a thing. It's kind of what we are that is that wakes up to itself. And when that happens, it's kind of like a lot of people think and talk about that as non-duality, but it's kind of like duality, it's like there's what's woken up to itself and then everything else, and it's kind of like we've created a duality between something and nothing, or existence and non-existence, and
Yes.
we've kind of
Transcendent
split.
and human,
Yeah,
formless
yeah,
and form. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and it's like that's a very valid kind
Hmm.
of, we can call it a developmental stage. um, a very valid and needed awakening to happen. When that awakening initially happens, it's like the door is open. Prior to that, the door isn't open, and we're still kind of seeking, and longing and wanting the truth. But once the door's open, it's like through that door is a whole universe, and it's the infinite. Of course there is. It's not just one thing. It's the infinite. So it's infinite through that door. It's like once we open that door, it's very easy to kind of get stuck there and think that this is all there is to this. It's this one experience slash out of experience kind of thing. And so and we can kind of get stuck there in terms of like negating everything, continuing to negate everything that's just not that's everything except that emptiness. And Um, so things like core wounds and trauma and even the idea of embodiment, um, they can all get kind of negated or dismissed as illusion or as just conceptual or as just in the mind, etc. Which is, there's truth to that. Because core wounds as a concept, if we're just kind of thinking it into existence and it becomes just a part of our mind's overlay, a set of ideas that we view reality through. Like it is part of that kind of trance, that we can kind of get caught in and become identified with and all of that. But like if we continue to do that and dismiss thing and just keep referencing this thing, the gap between the no thing and the something never closes. We just kind of keep pushing ourselves back into a kind of separation, like a different kind
Hmm.
of separation that we were in previously. And as you said, it's a separation between the human and the divine, or the form and the formless. Um, Nirvana and samsara. But as they say in Buddhism, the true nature of samsara is nirvana. Um, and the
Yeah.
form is the formless. So there's a different process and that happens post that door being opened in my experience, and a lot of people's experience that I've spoken to. And that's, we consider the first thing is like waking up. Then there's like a waking down, a back down in and through the human. Um, and as long as we're negating that, we kind of never, that never ends up happening. It's like we use our will, the will of the ego or the will of the self to perpetuate that split. that's happened from the initial awakening. And as long as that will is continuing to hold that split, that phase of coming down never happens because it will organically happen if we surrender and allow,
Hmm.
what's here to be here. And in that phase of coming down, we can really start to meet things that are very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
it's like if and it's kind of ridiculous because if someone falls over and breaks their arm, awake or not, like they're gonna say ouch
Hmm.
and be in a lot of pain, and they're not gonna be like, oh my arm's broken, my arm's not broken, it's an illusion, you know, like
There's
you know what I
nobody here
mean?
with a broken arm,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
also.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
A
Yeah.
broken arm is a concept. Like, it's like, well, actually, like, you need to go to the hospital.
Yeah.
Um, so it's like, we have to, like, there's so many different developmental kind of phases that it's like, this only apply, like, what I'm saying here applies to us when we're stuck in the emptiness. It's
Hmm.
like we have to kind of get honest with ourselves. And it's like, okay, my arm's broken.
Yeah.
I need to go get it fixed. And it's the same with core wounds. Core wounds aren't just a intellectual process,
Yeah.
that felt in and through the body. They're a very somatic experience. It's like when we experience anger, or anxiety or terror, it's like the veins in our neck become larger, the heart physically starts beating more. It's a very visceral, somatic, bodily experience. And core wounds exist on that same level.
Yeah.
It's not just a mental concept. Our mind can be completely quiet and our body can still be in a panic attack.
Hmm.
It's like
Absolutely.
us, yeah, it's that fight or flight response and that survival mechanism that exists below the frontal cortex, but it's lower parts of the brain, the limbic system and what they call the lizard brain. Those survival quadrants is where these core wounds and survival emotions and survival responses exist. And as long as we're negating, we're using the frontal cortex to override them.
Yeah.
It's just another way to try and not feel.
Yeah. Can you tell me with about your experience with that? Like, when did it become clear for you that there is stuff
Sure.
going on underneath the surface? Can you actually remember still, like a point where you
Yeah,
said,
yeah,
okay,
yeah,
this awakening is not cutting it. There's something else that needs to be
yeah.
done.
Sure. So it was kind of like the awakening happened, and I didn't know what had happened. Like I wasn't schooled in what awakening was,
Yeah.
at the time. Um, but it kind of happened, and there was this period of like just peace, but the peace, it was like in hindsight, I can see now, peace it's nothing but the absence of struggle, like peace between two nations is just the absence of conflict. So peace isn't a thing, it's just the absence of something else, it's what left is left when that inner conflict isn't there. And so there was that period of kind of the absence of the identity that had been there before, the identification. And I don't know how long it lasted, weeks or months, but then it was kind of like the gates of hell just opened up, and um, same as you, I just kept negating it and trying to stay in the peace, and it wasn't probably until a couple years later when my son was born and like I realized like it may as well be the paint on the wall. Like I'm not even here, and um like I'm just in nothingness
Yeah.
all the time.
Wow.
Like
Hmm.
in the void, it's strange how the word avoid and the void is so kind of closely linked. Um and like I met one of my kind of mentors and supports through my process at that time. And she said to me, like you've had this awakening. And she said, but what about everything else? Um, and I also listened to an interview around that time with Adyashanti, and they were talking about hiding out in emptiness, and kind of got
Hmm.
this feeling, oh, that's kind of what I'm doing here. And they asked for his advice, and he said, stop lying to yourself. and I just felt like this clench in the gut, like, oh, like that's kind of what I'm doing. I'm just using this to avoid life. And um, it was a kind of slow process then, and somatic work and learning to kind of work with my nervous system and go slowly, to learn to feel into things, not all at once, but bit by bit and pendulate kind of back out, you know, into a resource, which was the space. And it's, another thing is like resource, like return to source, so I could kind of bring attention, orient attention back to that and then back into the body and kind of
Hmm.
moving in and out. And as I started to do that, like my capacity to feel
Hmm.
built. And as I started to do that, that gap started to close, over time and really kind of seeing my own psychology and how my will had been created, like, because what is the will? Like what is the separate will? Like those kinds of questions, and really, really seeing how they, that mechanism would play out in my daily life and what was underneath the will,
Hmm.
what was really deeply underneath it. And like a core sense of helplessness, was there, and I could see the will because it was a kind of act of will, to try and negate and stay there, and so I started to see the will of the mind as just based on avoidance of that core wounding, that was there, and I used heroin for 11 years prior to waking up, and I was like, oh my God, like I'm using the awakeness in the same way I used heroin,
Yeah.
um, just as a running away, to try and stay safe from the pain that's underneath. And as it started to kind of come back down and the gap closed, like the will started to erode away, like
Hmm.
more and more. And there was more and more surrender, because like that, all traditions talk about surrender, but if we're kind of dismissing and negating, like that isn't surrender.
Yeah.
That's an act of force and will and manipulation of our
Hmm.
experience. And so I started to just notice all the ways my mind would manipulate experience. And
Beautiful.
slowly, as that started to erode away, kind of what you're left with is the very thing that it's trying to manipulate itself away from.
Yes.
And so then the gap just closes like more and
Hmm.
more and more until like the relative and the absolute, it's just one. You
Yeah.
can't separate the two. And like learning to work kind of really somatically, like learning to feel my way through things versus trying to kind of run from them or change them or fix them. Like it became a process of
Hmm.
allowing everything to be as it is and surrendering to everything as it is. And there's a quote by Saint Teresa, and I reference this often, but Saint Teresa of Avila, she was a Christian,
Hmm.
contemplative Christian, and she said, mistaken are those that think that union with God is states of rapture and ecstasy, but rather union with God is the surrender and subjection of our will into the will of God. And
Hmm.
it was exactly that experience, where it's like the will slowly erodes away, that will that wants to change, manipulate, remain in a fixed state. And the gap started closing, it's like I'm in a car crusher,
Hmm.
one of those things that crush cars into little cubes. Like it just
Yeah.
becomes so contracted, like so unbelievably contracted. And so much pain, like physically. And then it'd be expanse, like it'd open, and it was just closing and opening and closing and opening. And the mind wants it to always be open and, struggles and tries to change. But over time, it's kind of like um, you just start dying into
Hmm.
what is, and so it's kind of like those core wounds and those things that were being avoided are what you're left with, and more you're kind of brought to spiritual poverty, like it just that it becomes a losing game,
Yeah.
really for that will. You end up left with nothing to
Hmm.
to grasp or to hold on to as it, because if we're holding on to emptiness, we're turning it into something. It's not empty. It's
Yeah.
something, that we're using and holding on to. And
Um, because something that came to me also just before we started, because I was talking to someone yesterday about the sort of experience of me at the center, and that me being the continuous sort of self, like a reference point, what does it
mm,
so the way we sort of look at things, the way we perceive them, it keeps coming back to the me, like what does it mean about me?
yeah,
and and it was really interesting because I realized that I can totally see how, even just on the basis of what's unfolded here, that even after the first awakening, there was still very much this sense of me there left at
yeah,
the center. And actually, even after the dissolution of a sense of separation and the unity consciousness, it was still there. So, in other words, there was a sense of like the difference was that the I, let's put it this way, sort of no longer felt separate from God, no longer felt
yeah,
separate
yeah, yeah, yeah,
from the transcendent or formless or whatever. But and there was absolutely no way I could have seen it as I was in it. Like I've only been able to see it in retrospect that there was still this sense of me at the center. Only at some point it got so thin that there was just like I call it like a thin as a spider thread. Like that there was just no way that I would have known it was still there. And the reason why I mentioned this is because to me it relates to these core wounds that
yeah,
that we talk about, because it's almost like sometimes when I look at what the core wound actually is, it almost feels like it's actually that. It's like the conclusion that we arrive to about who we are, and that becomes this
yeah,
structure on a basis of what happened and how we interpreted it and everything. But I mean, I kind of knew that, but I just this morning, like literally just before we started, I kind of like saw it all the sort of like in a fresh new way, just in the context of this core wound, where how the small child sort of experiences things and then interprets this to mean something about me. Like, we talked about in other videos about, I didn't do something wrong. I am wrong. There's something wrong with me,
yes,
right?
yeah,
That if the child seeks to be seen and just seen, right? And then this doesn't happen. It's like I don't exist. The terror of that.
yeah, yeah,
But do you see how like
exactly, yeah,
this is why when I talk about this experience of me at the center, I sometimes when I really kind of go really into it with people, it's like it's such a moving thing to see, how the
yeah.
innocence of it all and how it all develops. So I don't know if this resonates at all, but I was wondering maybe we can talk a little bit about that and how that kind of starts so early on.
Sure. And you're right. It becomes the orienting center, like of the self, that the wound then references itself in relationship to everything else. And it really starts pre-verbally, it doesn't start as a self-referencing kind of center, but it starts as the first experience of subject and object, and it like can be so deep and so pre-verbal that it's like it doesn't exist in the realm of normal memory that we kind
Yeah.
of describe, like, or that we experience. And, so when we're in relationship to our mother, firstly, we're in a kind of symbiotic unity with our mother, or our primary caregiver. In the womb, we are in a symbiotic unity. We don't have an experience of being separate from the womb, it's separate from our environment. And then, as we come out, we still don't have that experience of being separate. We
Mm-hmm.
don't have anything to reference. There's no reference point between I and
Yeah.
object, mother
Yeah.
or caregiver. It's kind of like one big joined blob, a symbiosis. And um, the more, and then we're kind of in relationship to the bottle or our mother's breast or, our primary caregiver, that sense of warmth and connectivity. And it's impossible for a parent to meet all of their child's needs. Like it's impossible. And as that kind of happens, we experience a frustration, a friction, in that symbiosis and that frustration or friction. It's like, and you can hear it in an infant's cries. It's like this kind of real whiny, and you can feel it in your body when you're around an infant, like that kind of like nails down a chalkboard, like this certain cry, it's this certain sound, and it's that frustration,
Yeah.
it's the kind of the separating, the individuating from mother or let's just call it our holding
Mm-hmm.
object, and so as that kind of happens, it separates, and we experience through friction that separation, and we start to slowly experience ourselves as a separate object.
Yeah.
And at the exact same moment, the arising, like the subject and object arise together, at that exact same moment, our mother, primary caregiver, becomes an object. At the exact same moment, we start to experience ourselves as a separate subject. And so that's such a pre-verbal experience, we can't cognize it. We haven't even learned words at that phase, and that starts to happen about 6 months, 6 months of age. So they say in developmental psychology and object relations theory and all that sort of stuff. But as you go through the awakening process, you can really kind of map it out with object relations theory, like if you're
Yeah.
working somatically. And it's like, wow, that sense of frustration, like that kind of like burning frustration all through the body, it's like, wow, this and that helplessness, like a baby unable to scratch its own itch or even tell its mother that it's itchy, it's like that helplessness and
Oh,
frustration.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
visceral. It's
It
visceral.
is. It
Yeah.
is, yeah. It is. It is. And it's like that's the first experience of feeling separate from that symbiotic unity. And and by the way, helping to understand all this, for my mind really helped, still helps the process, unfold more organically with less resistance, because it's
Mm-hmm.
not like freaking out, like I don't know what's happening. Um, and then it's like we start to kind of split off from our mother and start to develop a center, but the center can't yet reference itself as a center.
Yeah.
It's kind of like this floating eye point, that can't really reflect on itself at that point. And then it's like more and more happens. There's more frustrations in the relationship. And, you know, like it's much safer, like for survival reasons, for a child to believe that they are the problem than to feel like their environment or the people looking after them are the problem. Because if they see their parents as deficient or their caregivers, that's a threat to their survival,
Yep.
because, well, they're the ones looking after me. So it becomes safer. It's a way of protecting the idea that there's love in the world, and so they start to reflect back on themselves, when their needs aren't met, like there's something wrong with me,
Mm-hmm.
and that inner sense of deficiency and lack. And that also starts pre-verbally. It starts as a felt sense experience, a sense of kind of lack. And it's also like the sense of like core deficiency of the self. And this is such a broad spectrum, some people have that wound like quite minimally,
Mm-hmm.
they don't like certain things about themselves, and whereas then other people have like extreme self-loathing and self-disgust, and there's something existentially wrong with me, and just that sense of inner deficiency can be completely extreme, and then it kind of like develops into a narrative, of images, like, and words, like a self-image, a core kind of self-image, like that then that center identifies with, and then the words and the belief systems become a reflective mechanism. Like, this is
Yeah.
who I am. There's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough. I'm unlovable. It's all the same thing. It's the same wound. People think like, oh yeah, I'm going to work on my unlovable wound. I'm going to work on my not good enough wound. I'm going to work on my there's something wrong with me wound. I don't belong, etc., etc. It's like you look at all of those, they're all just pointing to the exact same sense of deficiency.
Mm-hmm.
They all say the same thing, just in contextualized differently. And as that kind of develops, it becomes that kind of core wound of the self, but most of us develop beyond that, and that falls completely out of consciousness,
Yeah.
and we fall into a kind of overcompensating identity,
Oh yeah.
and our will then gets structured, the ego's will then gets structured on top of that and becomes a way of kind of treading water, and then it becomes I'm good enough, or I'm a gangster, or I'm a criminal. That was kind of my one, I'm hardcore, like kind of thing, like, and it was covering up this like deep sense of shame, and it became a overcompensating self-image that covered up that deep sense of deficiency
Yeah.
that was there. And, then we fall into these kind of images and narratives, like an ocean of self-images and other images and belief systems and kind of big webs of structures that then become the ego that we're identified with. But deeper at the core of them is that sense of deficiency. And
Yeah.
underneath that sense of deficiency is the terror, often the terror of annihilation,
Yeah.
terror of disappearance. So, and it like it's as unique as a fingerprint how it all plays out. But just from observing many clients working with it, follows pretty consistent themes.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
what do you say to precisely because you've seen so many people? Because sometimes there's this belief that if you had a really nice childhood or caring parents that basically at least tried to sort of nurture you and meet your needs and everything, that therefore you're sort of immune and one then doesn't have those kinds of core wounds because of it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Like, that's not my observation. Like, my observation is like they can be very minimal compared to much more extreme
Hmm.
circumstance, and the capacity for like the organism to regulate itself and move these things through can be like, ones and zeros, opposite ends of the spectrum,
Hmm.
day and night kind of thing. But I'm also aware, like, because I work as a kind of somatic therapist, and I'm
Hmm.
constantly helping people with their trauma and all that. Like, the people on this end of the spectrum are the people that come to me,
Hmm.
So it's not like someone who had a really healthy and good childhood is going to come for
Right.
somatic therapy. So I can see my observation can also possibly be bias in that
Hmm.
sense. But so just through observing and through kind of understanding this, there's no way an ego and a sense of self can develop without some level of wounding.
Yeah.
It kind of has to. It's part of its development, whether that's minimal or whether that's really significant. And all all ego identity will have at the core of it an like terror of annihilation
Yeah.
as well. It's just the degree and density of what's stacked on top of that core terror that varies. I think it's varies in density, not in whether you have it or you don't.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
reason why I'm bringing also this up because I worked with someone who actually shared with me, and they will be fine with me mentioning that because actually that's not the only time I've heard that. And this was actually really illuminating and kind of eye-opening for me, where after awakening, this person said to me that they basically held on to this growing up in a healthy in their mind environment and had a happy childhood, that they were actually holding on to that as a story. Like they didn't actually
Mm.
realize that it was a kind of story that they lived, sort of accepted as fact. And after awakening,
Yeah.
when the pain started coming up to the surface, all sorts of things, they were completely confused because how is that possible? I don't remember any trauma. I was totally looked after and I have very loving parents and things like that. And it took them many years to actually realize that this idealized image
Yeah,
of the
exactly.
family and their childhood, and not that there wasn't bits of truth in it. There was actually quite a bit of truth in it, but it did serve as a way to initially not acknowledge actually some painful facts about their parents.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's I
Right.
call that childhood
Can
idealization,
you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, and it becomes a very similar way to kind of hiding out in emptiness, we the belief in it's the same thing really, that we
Yeah.
believe that narrative and those images and those that they are part of that overcompensating identity that keeps these core wounds at bay. And it doesn't mean our parents were bad. It just
Yep.
means our parents were human. I'm a parent. I've got two kids. And I have studied this stuff back to front, and like I've had all these awakenings and whatnot, and I have wounded my children. I know I have,
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and like without meaning to, and it's innocent again, and it's like, like we carry not like generations of pain,
Hmm.
that get passed down, and it's like also, I see it as also needed because it's almost um, like imagine we didn't have that. Imagine we had both parents who never got frustrated with us, never got angry with us, never kind of resisted us, never got stressed out themselves, like never did it. We'd have no resilience to life,
Hmm.
and relationship. And then imagine going out into the world, as an adult.
A
Like
bit of
you'd
a
have
shock to the
no
system. Yeah.
resilience.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So rupture is really important, and and so is repair. And so, conflict is important, stress is important, all of those things, they build resilience. Um, and it's like our parents also are wounded, like
Yep.
everyone has wounds, everyone has relational dynamics. It's like this idea of perfection, like it doesn't exist.
Hmm.
Like it's
Hmm.
an act of cruelty because we're all imperfect and on the human level. And so it's like those overcompensating identities when someone first comes to me and it like they say that like, oh, I've got constant anxiety and I'm struggling at work and my relationship's falling apart, but I had a perfect childhood.
Yep.
Like as soon as they say that, it's like red flag. Like it's and it can be a really hard thing to kind of break through because it means admitting it's the child
Yep.
inside of us not wanting to see their parents in any kind of negative light. That becomes a
Hmm.
protective mechanism. Um, and so breaking that down can be really, really difficult and really, really painful, because seeing our parents as imperfect, it can start to evoke those wounds as that overcompensating ego structure starts to kind of break down. And then you're
Yeah.
left with the wounds that were there. And there can be a lot of guilt as well, like
Ooh,
in
yeah.
admitting that to ourselves, like, oh my God, like they weren't perfect. I have a friend whose mum died quite early in his life, and like he idolized her after her death to all the way through his adulthood. And it took him a long time to be able to start to see, wow, like I've turned her into God, like just
Yes.
she couldn't do anything wrong. And when he started to admit those things, more grief started to come up, and he started to feel through some of the wounds, was able to kind of get honest with himself on a deeper level and feel through some of those wounds that were there. But again, it's totally innocent. Like we can't
Yeah.
not do it, and it might also evoke a huge sense of anger at our parents that we don't want to feel. You
Yeah.
know, because where there's wounds, there's anger,
Yeah. I mean,
and
it
feeling
can
that
be
anger.
it can be a
Go ahead.
really painful experience to go through in and of itself. I'm just talking within
Big
the
shit.
the context of awakening process or not. Like I can tell you that this was one of my first kind of profound insights that I had as a teenager. That my parents, my family, they were totally inherently innocent, and that no one was doing anything on purpose. That no one actually knew what they were doing. They were just doing what they knew to do. But then I also remember that after the first awakening, when stuff started coming up to the surface, like anger, like guilt, like all sorts of things to do with my upbringing and with my parents, I was, like I said, pushing all that stuff away. And it became the sort of either or. So now this insight was sort of co-opted by the mind in a way to shield myself from experiencing these things. So it was kind of a shock to the system when, for the first time, the anger toward my parents came through full on,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
full
yeah.
on.
I know
And
that
not just
experience.
anger, Matt. It was like hatred
Murderous
and
rage.
murderous
Yeah,
rage, hatred, all sorts of insults,
yeah,
and that, and my Catholic, and simultaneously my Catholic upbringing, was like bringing this guilt to the surface
yeah, yeah,
about
yeah,
even
yeah,
thinking this way or feeling this way toward my
yeah,
parents. But at that point, there was just no other way. There was no stopping this. It was just a happening. And I remember just experiencing so much liberation in that being allowed without judgment. My God, I cannot even underline this. Like, and seeing how I can simultaneously see their innocence, their inherent innocence, but also totally fully acknowledge the bits and pieces where they fucked up, okay? You know, and that I had the right to be angry about that, and that one doesn't exclude the other, and that I could literally totally love someone and hate them at the same time. And it was wonderful to basically finally express, albeit just to myself, in the
yeah.
privacy of my little corner wherever I was sitting as this was happening. And it became part of how these core wounds started to finally be acknowledged, and all the
Yeah,
emotions that came with that were finally allowed. And it was incredibly important journey to
for
go through.
sure.
So, do you want
Yeah.
to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I resonate, like
Murderous rage.
murderous rage. Yeah,
We
like
didn't hurt
and it
anybody, by the way. Just
no,
like
no, no. And it's like, watching kids develop, as you're raising kids, you see it in them. When they're really young and like you say, no, you can't have that toy. It's like murderous rage comes up. Like, it comes out as tantrums and like biting and scratching, like they want to kill you, in that moment. It's an instinct. Yeah, and so those instinctual energies, they get repressed, throughout our childhood in order to maintain a sense of connection to our parents. Yeah,
hmm
and become kind of socialized, to be able to live in the world. Like otherwise, we're going to be living from these instinctual energies, and like we wouldn't have a society if that was the case. And so that murderous rage, as the gap starts to close, as we stop manipulating our experience and kind of twisting the arm of life to kind of I want to kind of corner myself into this experience because I like this better than that. And as the gap starts to close and our will starts to diminish, it's like these are the things that start to come up. And we start to say, ah, this is what I was using emptiness to avoid. This is what I was using food to avoid. This is what I was using,
Yeah.
heroin
No
to avoid.
self or
Yeah,
yeah.
whatever it is, trying to, and or what I'm idealizing my childhood to avoid. Like it's all the same thing. They're all avoidance mechanisms, innocent avoidance
Mm-hmm.
mechanisms. Um, and these kind of instinctual energies like that rage, I resonate so much, years of it, like of rage just bursting up, like, and it's like bursting through the seams of my nervous system and like
Mm-hmm.
unable to repress it anymore. And I kind of feel like, oh God, I could kill someone, like, with this
Yep.
energy. And like you said, I'd lost the capacity for repression, like it was happening, and because when the center falls away, there's not really anything that can push things back down anymore.
Yes.
And but at a certain point, it's like you start to really allow it, and it's like a fire, like a purifying fire that just starts to push through like layers of conditioning. And I started to recognize like when it's fully allowed without the distortion of the beliefs and the self-referencing and all that, like it's just pure power. Like, and I was like, oh, this is what they mean by Shiva, that energy of just like power, like divine power, just blasting through certain aspects of the ego and
Yep.
conditioning. And, I was like, oh, wow, like this sense of inner strength, like this inner power, this kind of immovability. It was really kind of a belly energy, like the lower hara, lower dantian, and that sense of strength, like it's almost like a mountain, again, really physical. It kind of like, I know in Zen they call the belly like a mountain of emptiness,
Mm-hmm.
and it's that sense of like really being present but immovable, and that capacity to say no,
Yep.
to have boundaries, to like, a sense of aliveness in it. And it was like, wow, this was really repressed, like, throughout my life. And I realized it's a quality of presence, of divinity, and it's expressing itself through this kind of uh you could say individual focal point,
Yes.
but that's, yeah, like we could call it the soul, whatever we want to call it. Like this focal point, it's kind of individuating itself into this kind of fierce presence, that isn't the same as the will. It's coming from a different place. It doesn't kind of
Yep.
reference back on itself. It's just kind of spontaneous in its nature. And as that rage kept coming through, there was also waves of terror really associated with it, because that feeling of like there's no control, like it's chaos, like absolute chaos. There's there's nothing that can kind of stop. It's got a mind of its own kind of thing. And I remember the terror of insanity really coming up when that rage was coming up. Like I'm gonna
Mm-hmm.
go insane. Like it's too much, and the mind just freaking out. And it continues years and years later. Like it continues to refine and notice more subtle resistances. It wasn't like boof, it happened once and then just pinpoint perfection. No, it's been more like ongoing, like it's continuously closing gaps and purifying itself. But it's like, and then underneath that, there's that sense of terror and that sense of helplessness and that sense of grief, and like it kind of just moves and kind of uncouples and kind of reorganizes the whole system so it can learn to function from a different place. And I feel like that's the process of embodiment, and meeting core wounds is kind of the crux of that, because the core wounds are what doesn't trust life, that feels like it's not held. Because when we're little, anytime we don't feel held by our environment, we contract against it. And that contraction leaves an imprint and stays there. And
Yep.
so as the core wounds open, as these contractions open, the core wounds reveal themselves. And then another contraction will open until we kind of like disappear more and more into
Yeah.
everything, nothing,
Yeah. Yeah.
whatever's here, what's here.
Yeah, because I mean, it's, sometimes I know that different people mean different things by embodiment, because sometimes it feels to me like maybe it sounds like you're becoming someone, like you're
Yeah,
becoming someone else, that like almost developing a new, better kind of identity, or becoming someone better who basically copes better or functions better with, or is devoid of things like anger or
no,
sort of those kinds of things. So maybe we've got maybe 10 minutes left. So I just thought that maybe we can close up talking
yeah, yeah,
a
yeah, yeah,
little bit
yeah,
about that. And then when we get back, I really encourage everyone to either leave your questions around core wounds, maybe even specific core wounds if you'd like, in the comments, or email them to me. And then when we get back together, either me and Matt or Matt and Noel, then we will do part 2, and we will be
yeah,
able to go more into the specifics. But I thought maybe I don't know, it just sort of came through.
yeah,
So
yeah,
so maybe we can talk a little bit
sure.
about that. How this is not what we mean
Yeah.
anyway by embodiment.
Well, it's and anything we talk about is can be misconstrued to our preconceived notions as to what it is. Like
Mm-hmm.
if we hear the word embodiment, we've already got an idea as to what we think that means. Um, yeah, and like so much of the idea of embodiment, and this only applies in the context of awakening. We can be practicing embodiment and somatic work and all of that sort of stuff, just and live a kind of unawakened life. Like
Yeah.
really, like it doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
There's not even any need to wake up really. Um, People might think there is, but there's not. Like, you know, um,
Sorry about sorry to disappoint.
yeah, like there's no real
Yeah.
need,
Yeah.
um, and but like the embodiment aspect post awakening is it's kind of just the closing of the gap, really. It's really hard to kind of talk about because our minds, as they do, co-opt everything that it hears, and it becomes something that it then tries to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not something that the mind does, or the me, the self does. It's something that happens.
Yeah.
Like it's it. And the bizarre thing is, like, it also never happened because there was never actually a gap.
Yep.
It's like there was an appearance of a gap. We
Yes.
were manipulating experience that created the experience of waking up
Mm-hmm.
to something,
Mm-hmm.
awakeness, that then comes in and closes the awakeness, then closes the gap. But there was never actually a gap. Like the fact is that it never actually happened, and the mind never really purified itself like on an absolute level.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
didn't happen. But we have to speak in terms of this because as we're navigating it, which we always are, this is how it kind of unfolds, a lot of the time, and it follows these kinds of themes. But embodiment, in this context is kind of it embodying itself. It kind of like like the erosion away of the old functioning centers, the old ways of functioning and being in the world, the kind of energetic orienting centers that moved the body, that, related, that felt like it was the doer. That they
Yeah.
they erode away more and more of that energy, that underlying energy erodes away. And then as that erodes away, what's left starts to orient and move the system, and we have this idea like we're going to be saints or perfect people or anything like that. It's far from perfect, it doesn't hold up to any kind of mental or moral standard that the
No.
mind might place upon it. Like it
Yeah.
can be a total dick, and it can be crude, and it can be blunt, and it can be all the things that we could kind of frown upon, but it's more like what we've woken up to then just starts to take over your life. Like essentially starts to embody itself. And it's like everyone, it's almost like, have you ever heard of that zombie fungus?
No.
It's like this fungus, like this kind of mushroom fungus that the ants eat, and then
Uh-huh.
the fungus kind of takes over their brain and just
Oh my
like
God.
walks around as the ants, like it hijacks and takes over their will,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like that at a certain point. Like you're like,
I
oh
can
my
see
God,
that. No,
like
I
this,
can totally see
yeah,
that. Yeah.
this thing is taking over my life, like I don't have, I'm losing my own will, like, and it's, like being in the jaws of the tiger. Like as
Mm-hmm.
Ramana would say, or they say, don't start chasing God because if you chase him long enough, he'll start chasing you, and
Yeah.
it's kind of that sense of like it's taking over, and this is where like surrender and devotion and those aspects, like those kind of organic qualities that were in my own system, and still continue to, because it's ever refining itself, become the kind of willingness to surrender and be taken, every aspect be taken
Yeah.
more and more and more and more and more, like not just the center, but the will,
Yeah.
everything about you. And so it starts to kind of swallow itself,
Mm-hmm.
that's the experience of it, and starts to take over. The conditioning and the wounds start to surface, and we kind of like lose all control over our
Mm-hmm.
lives, and that's kind of the embodiment. It's not only about coming into the body, like that's the main aspect of it, but as it comes into the body, all of, because it never actually does, because the body is actually it already, but
Yes.
it wakes itself up within it, but it meets everything that had been repressed during that time, but there's like I love Adya's term, like redemptive love. Like
Mm-hmm.
it comes back for itself to wake
Yeah.
everything back up that is still unconscious, that's still stuck in its kind of knots and conditioned responses and contractions and wounding, and it starts to come back for the parts of itself that aren't on board yet, that aren't aligned. And so, it's kind of, it starts to integrate itself. And that's a process, it happens. Sorry, my dog's barking. It happens over time. Like it's
Yeah.
not like awakening that happens now. It's a slow burn, like an
Yeah.
erosion.
And nor to me at least the embodiment isn't sort of another self-improvement quote unquote
No,
project where basically the purpose of embodiment is to basically rid yourself of all the patterns, of all the wounds, or
no.
where there's now the need to sort of almost like dig in for things,
No.
and I need to get rid of these patterns and I need to get rid of all
Yeah,
these
yeah,
wounds
yeah,
and
yeah.
see, right? No, there's just like life has a way of just bringing
Yeah,
this up on its own
exactly.
when needed, and the timing is quote unquote, perfect with that, because I can see how this is another kind of aspect that I've been seeing, um, in how that can turn into this kind of project. And I love how you mention children, because sometimes when I think of embodiment, is almost like this return to this quote
Return, yeah.
unquote like natural kind of innocence, you know, and spontaneity of expression before it was sort of co-opted by the mind and judged as this or that, wrong, shameful, and so on. This is why I kind of love, I've always loved watching sort of toddlers, like children, and I know that they can be like very dramatic, but there's just such like beauty in many ways. As distressing as it is, I mean, I've only dealt with my nephew as a toddler, so
Yeah.
when I remember being with him, and just the naturalness of how he will be able to move through like a whole bunch of different emotions within like half an hour,
Yeah.
but there was just something so seeming about that. And but once the emotion was kind of quote unquote, uh maybe the word allowed is not, maybe just lived, once
Yeah, lived,
it
lived,
was a
yeah.
sort of experience, then that was it. It's like it left no residue. It was like literally nothing happened.
Yeah.
And so to me that's like it's kind of when I think of embodiment, it's like a natural, it's like a return to that, where there's basically
Yeah.
no fear of these emotions, no judgment of these emotions. They are perfectly sort of just seen as part of this
Yeah.
experience.
Exactly. And at the same time, we don't turn back into toddlers throwing tantrums, when we
Exactly.
don't get a toy. It's like there's a maturation that kind of
Of
happens
course.
at the
Yeah.
same time. But it's like embodiment is kind of like that gap closing, and it's kind of the closing of separation, and it's kind of like there's no more separation between you and the felt sense of
Yeah.
experiencing, and then it's kind of like the organism lives,
Yeah.
the organism just organisms, like it just kind of like lives itself without the sense
Yeah.
of having a separate will from what's happening,
Mm-hmm.
and like there's, in my experience, it's like, because I could have said this 2 years ago, but it's like in hindsight, it's like, wow, there was still lots of gaps then, and now
Yeah,
it
oh
feels
yeah.
like so much
Mm-hmm.
more seamless, and so and like totally, I believe like in 10 years from now, I'll look back now and be like, like
Yeah.
like whoa, like I was so fragmented,
Or something. Yeah, yeah.
like so it's like constantly closing separation, it's not just one plop and it's all done, it's there's always refinement, that
Yeah.
that kind of that happens. And so and that's the kind of embodiment. Embodiment is, when the process of waking up starts to close the gap, and then there's like close the gap of separation, and then there's no more sense of our experience being fragmented into parts.
Yeah.
It's like experience is one unified happening.
Mm-hmm.
And that for it to be one unified happening, everything is included. So it starts as a process of negation. It's
Mm-hmm.
illusion. It's not this, it's not that. And we kind of can hide out there as we
Mm-hmm.
spoke about. But then the process of inclusion, starts to happen. And until there's like, you can't kind of
Mm-hmm.
separate anything anymore, it's just
Yeah.
so unified that like you can't even find an intermediary
That's
anymore.
it. That's
There's
it.
yeah,
Which is why I think, and again, I know that this is like semantics and everything, but actually, in the way things unfolded here, there's actually been no separation, but then there was no distinction, and actually, that
yeah,
was kind of really very different, even though it seems like it's the same thing. Where with no separation, there seems to be like the two things, let's say the formers and form sort of became one, but I still perceive them in some way as two different things, but
subtle,
they were
yeah, it's
simply one.
subtle,
Whereas with no distinction, it's like the distinction collapsed. Like they were no longer
yeah,
seen as even two different things. And like you said, but I think the bit that was important in that is the quote unquote intermediary, the one
yeah,
somewhere there in the center in between. And I think that's when that went, the distinction collapsed, quote
yeah,
unquote, So, can I just add at the end that my tantrums continued into my adulthood for a very long
yeah, yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah. I get it.
just,
Yeah,
just on a different note, and the awakening and the embodiment bit is basically something that helped with that, a lot. But yeah, goes back to what we were saying. Not perfect human being, not devoid of like,
yeah,
stuff still playing
exactly.
out and stuff like that. So, Matt, thank you so much for your time, and I'm really looking forward to sitting with you and know again in July or August, so we can actually go into some specifics around maybe particular core wounds and do that.
Sure. Yeah, love to. Thanks so
Brilliant.
much.
Thank
All right.
you.